Delicate Subject, Chapter 19. She stared at the glass in her cabin bathroom, wanting to smash it, to deny that her face could look perfectly normal when she was screaming inside. Telling. She had thought her cabin, as though Thane and Garrus had already been sliced away from her literally instead of figuratively. She had always tried to include them. Now they had their own cabins, though one stood empty. This used to be their cabin. She wanted to chew on the glass and spit blood-spattered shards back. She wanted to swallow and slice and have a visible reason to bleed internally. But she tried not to break useful things. She tried not to go after the wrong target. She was a useful thing. She wasn't the target. She heard it in her head, in Yalis' voice. "You're a protector, Jane." Pride in herself had been twisted like a corkscrew into her heart. Now she wondered if she could ever hear the word protector without feeling a ghost tremor in her gut, a shadow, and an echo. No longer a clean word, a proud word. Now it was an entry point for an infestation. Shivers went down her spine, half strangling and half caressing. That was Yalis' path into her mind. That's how learning from dreams and her reactions to attempted intimidation paid off. Yalis learned she couldn't hurt Jane into action or intimidate her into action. So Yalis chose to be rescued. Because Jane could not help herself. Yalis had watched and waited, set herself out as harmless, helpful, distressed bait. Waited like a patient vampire to be invited inside until it was Jane's idea. Then she'd been able to disable the security, the alarms, redecorate. Jane's emotional attachment to this ship and her job bypassed her intellectual objections, made it impossible for her to fail to do what she was built to do, what she sculpted herself to do, what Yalis encouraged her to do. Get back to the ship, protect the innocent. Jane had spent uncounted time unconscious. Hypnotic agents introduced, suggestion whispered. Jane was distracted and exhausted by what was happening while she was awake. Yalis' best work happened when Jane was unconscious. Her task made easier by the growing, burrowing fibers in her brain, until Jane was under her control. Mostly under her control. A crucial distinction, and the only reason why she was able to stand here contemplating chewing glass physically to reflect how she felt emotionally. But it would give her away, result in her getting caught being self-destructively crazy. She was the index case for indoctrination, and how much trust could she really rebuild? How many trips to insanity to blow off some steam could she afford? No more. No more trips. That's what people who wanted to get caught did, and Jane contemplated whether or not she wanted to get caught. Whether she was unfit for duty and should accept that. Confess. Accepting was not one of her strengths. She clearly had an aversion to confession and had done too much of it lately. Jane had become the greatest security leak and the greatest threat to the Normandy. But her emotional attachment to this ship and her job was strong, resurgent, amplified. Part Yalis' influence, but also Jane's underlying bedrock. With the recovery of her intellect and memory, she absorbed shock after shock, realization after realization, bile and pride mixed and inseparable. She could know she was crazy, but she would no more admit the extent of her crazy than she would have asked Mo for dancing lessons. She wasn't crazy enough to ask for command back, and she wouldn't anytime soon, until she was sure her crazy quotient had diminished. Maybe not even then, what with the indoctrination. So everyone was watching, and that was fine with her. Garrus said they'd had no leads to find her, that they had spent exhausted weeks chasing down cold and fake trails, and the only thing they could do was wait and watch. He didn't say go silently crazy, but clearly he had gone silently crazy. She had gone loudly crazy. Crazy for some people wasn't a line that they crossed and stayed forever. Some people could live so near to that line that they crossed over and crossed back several times a day, hour by hour, minute by minute. Sometimes crazy was a vacation home, a relief, a valve for pressure. That's where Jane was, right on that border. The will to stay on one side failing, getting blindsided and responding to internal stimuli. That thing she knew not to do but couldn't help doing. She had some leeway, she knew. She had a right to be crazy for a bit, but she wondered if a bit meant forever. She and Garrus were both strong, resilient, experienced. They could both heal, cross back, but they'd both gone, both been there. Garrus had revisited 2 years of helpless grief in 7 weeks. He had failed to protect her or anticipate the danger. She tried to think of what Thane had gone through, was going through, could not other than that he was stoic and resourceful. She had not asked many questions, and Garrus had not volunteered much information. Garrus waited for her to speak, stuck to her topic and her tone. Thane lived in places that reminded her of her spinal cord right now. Calcified, limited, shallow roots and claustrophobia. Spending so much time with Yalis had been educational. Granted, Yalis had to put in a lot of work. It had taken a lot of effort. Say what you want about Jane's fortitude, and Jane did, but she'd been a massive pain to deal with, and what Yalis wanted had not happened. 7 seconds, Yalis, my love. You knew it was a gamble. You had to hope that I would not, could not do exactly what I did. As for your hopes, I don't know what they were, as fragile and changeable as your skin, your tongue, your thoughts. You tried to squeeze all the rebellion out of me, and you knew I couldn't say it and would choke on the words, would only have the strength for a few seconds. I could explain my stutters and freezing as diminished capacity, pain, my reaction to trauma. You coached me on it extensively. We would have gone to the med bay, questions deferred due to the relief of having me back and the immediacy of your injuries. And somewhere in there, Dr. Shakwas would have been compromised, and it would have been over. You wouldn't have had to try turning Garrus or Thane, just been Skidder, the abused drudge that aided me during my kidnapping and interrogation by Vakarian agents, rescued by me, vouched for by me, watched over zealously by me. The same way I'd watch over any of my people. You would have used your patience and lent me yours, waited until nerve endings took hold. You're a woman after my own heart. Of my own heart, Yalis. And I know you could have brought me on unconscious. And maybe you should have. You could have drugged me, but you knew Thane and Garrus would be suspicious, and Karen would examine me, and the only way you could win the long con would be to sell me as damaged but brave. Let me explain. I wasn't of use, unconscious, or dead. I was of use as a puppet figurehead, and you needed to deliver that package. And you couldn't. You did your best, and I salute you, and I think you knew you couldn't do it, and you walked in anyway. You kept me healthy. You could have killed me easily at any point, given up and taken off, left my body to rot, never recovered, escaped your duty, saved yourself. I think you thought of what would happen if you let me go. Leaving me alive in that place, or what would happen to me if I succeeded in killing you, alone and so fucked up I wouldn't have stepped outside that threshold out of fear. Likely dying in that room, weak, confused, and alone. Like a dog unwilling to leave her master's body. You got me back here. Somehow you kept 2 large Batarians and a highly intelligent Asari terrified, and you kept Mo and Tog from ripping me to shreds. They were afraid of you, and you had your huddling back turned to them all the time. How in hell did you do that? When the fuck did you sleep? Stockholm Syndrome does not cover this. I was gone because of you, but I'm alive now, also because of you. And now we know how at least one version of indoctrination works. I wonder if that was your hope in the end, that you would take your chances, roll the dice, knowing that despite all your planning and effort, the odds were against you. That I was against you still. You accepted any and every outcome. Your plan might have worked. I respect audacity in the face of low odds of success in an intelligent and scary woman. Can't help myself. It's my nature. Can't stop feeling that way any more than I could stop breathing. You took away most of my words, but you couldn't predict what it felt like to see Garrus rush toward me with love. What it felt like to see him in combination with the deck under my feet. How he and I shared symbols that even if you saw them, even if I'd told you, you wouldn't comprehend them for what they were, or that he would understand so quickly. You knew the words I might use, the words you would use, and you eliminated those. But you didn't find the words I did use. You didn't truly believe love existed, couldn't fathom it, couldn't predict it. And you were becoming increasingly baffled by and entangled in something you couldn't reach and couldn't break. Something that began to soak into your skin, your mind, through contact with me. You tried to figure out what it was. And unfortunately for you, you did. You got in my head through subterfuge, and I got in yours through osmosis. Jane almost smiled at herself. Go me. She gave it a try. Smiled. It was terrible. False. didn't reach her eyes. Her features turned slack, and she tilted her head forward so her eyes looked slightly menacing. Predatory response. Better. More believable. 7 seconds and my team. 7 seconds and Garrus's quick thinking. 7 seconds and Thane's immediate execution of instincts that kept him alive, kept him from being shot, and had Yalis down. 7 seconds of Garrus going to Jane's rescue and Thane going to Jane's vengeance, needing each other to get it done, not having to choose between them. Jane had seen the recording of the incident, her own face contorted and murderous. Thane had not hesitated, had sidestepped Jane as though she had not existed, counted on Garrus to restrain her, evaded Yalis's aim, and that movement turned into a leap around her, hooking his arm around her throat, his other arm disarming her pistol, dragging her into the shuttle. If Jane ever needed an example of why her team was so effective, why they had the reputation they had, it was in that moment. Despite her, they knew each other well enough to restrain her and stop the threat. On the recording, Jane couldn't see what happened once they were inside, but his face, her face, identical in aspect, beautiful dolls, dreadful, showing no effort, no intention on their faces as they regarded each other as obstacles. Would Yalis have killed everyone on board? Looks like she might have tried, Jane aside. The two of them with a ship and Edie. Yalis would have known, must have known. She could have done nothing to hamper an unshackled AI that was as loyal to the crew of the Normandy as Jane was. Perhaps don't underestimate the scary Drell lady. Face it, you can't even figure out what she was doing, and you were there. You were her primary target. She didn't need to protect your crew or the ship. The Normandy had gone down once before, and you still emerged as a figurehead, so why? Did Yalis bring Jane back here? Yalis, you came up against some surprises as you rooted around in my head, saw your odds diminish, your contingency plans fail. You still didn't give up. Yalis was brave and smart and determined. Yalis went down fighting. She went down. And she hadn't had to. There had been rage on Jane's face, horror on Garrus's face, nothing on Thane's or Yalis's faces but hidden purpose. Maybe Thane and Yalis belonged together. The sick thought made her want to retch a few ways, and revoltingly, jealousy was in there, twining and sticky. Jealousy was the strangest visitor to this new party that was inside her head. Chemically induced, she knew. It was petty and tight and small and volatile. Jealousy with flashes of being infuriated and bereft that she didn't know where Yalis was. Flashes of their bodies entwined, venom and moans. That would be sickeningly comforting, but the reality is that possibly they were both entirely unaffected, behaving as though they were enthralled. Something they could both do with her if they tried. Something Jane could not do with either of them, even if she tried. Outclassed all around. Were Drell assassins immune to Drell assassin venom? She had no idea. So many things about which she had no idea. Yalis had been borderline panicked, her real face shifting into Skitter's face when she'd found out about Thane. Yalis watched her odds diminishing, that there was someone who could look at her and know the potential for who she was, that Thane could brush a finger over Yalis' skin and know with certainty. Someone who would not buy your bullshit, Yalis. Someone who had been teaching me to recognize your brand of bullshit in the world around me. That added layer of me knowing what you were every time you kissed me. That it was familiar to me, that I was possibly one of the only few living people who knew what it was like. Sought it out. Wasn't afraid of it. That it would never be enough on its own to keep me under your control, and that even with indoctrination, I was problematic. If Thane hadn't been there, hadn't shared his venom, hadn't taught me Pon Ifa, I might have accepted you wholeheartedly as Skidder. I would never have had those 7 seconds. He was the one that brought you down. Jane had said to Yalis, "You're like him. He's a good man. He loves me and trusts me. He would never hurt you if I told him how much you'd helped me." The look on her face. I've learned what it looks like when an otherwise deeply disciplined drill face loses its shit. And that was what it looked like. That was possibly the moment when Yalis began to suspect she would fail. So many things mean more and less sense now. She wondered if Thane already knew Yalis. Jane hadn't seen recognition on his face, but she didn't see anything on either of their faces. Dreadful. Beautiful. Both of them. Jane's internal voice turned softer, and she said to herself tentatively, "I know you can't stop the flashes, but stop making them worse. It's gonna get better. You know, because you've done this before. Breathe. Count." She counted slowly, fingernails digging into her palms, helping her focus, but not enough to draw blood or leave a mark. A mark would be seen. Garrus would smell blood. He could already smell everything else on her, she had no doubt. Fear and anger and chaos. Maybe insanity. She wondered if indoctrination had a scent, if he'd been relieved as the chemicals and drugs evaporated out through her pores, dissipated, hopefully making him feel she might come back to herself, back to him. Maybe. But then the screaming started, didn't it? She had been under until they'd delicately extracted nerve tissue from her brain, leaving holes and tracts they hoped would heal, holes that dripped thresher maw acid into every bit of physical sensation she experienced. She hoped she came back to her own scent, that he'd have something to repay his faith, some measurable reality out of her control, something she couldn't manipulate. She opened her eyes and started counting from the beginning. Again, promising herself that she would take everything Thane had taught her about appearance, about tells, and use it. She couldn't afford to feel bad about hiding, couldn't lose her nerve. Couldn't fail now. Couldn't fail ever. Couldn't fail again. She wondered if Thane would ever make it back to see the recovery he had made possible, the survival he had willed to her. If she could look at Garrus without... She couldn't decide what she was going without. Too many things. She'd been convinced she wasn't a clear and present danger. She'd convinced herself. She knew what it took to make her a clear and present danger. This was not it. This was Aftermath, sickness, health, shame, pride. The worst of her withdrawal spent in a medical coma, though she'd still broken through. They should get some of the stuff Yalis used. It had been very effective. Another question to ask her. So you know that stuff that kept me under? Could you hook me up? I'd really like to know what that was. You are occasionally too pragmatic, Jane. The crew would submit to scanning once a week, including her, and that should be sufficient. She was stable, no growth, and scanning was getting technically better, able to isolate the target more clearly with contrast. Kasumi had also rigged the scanner to make sure the results couldn't be doctored. The images were flagged and distributed if there was an anomaly or tampering. All maintenance on the equipment was witnessed. Edie recorded each scanning session, several witnesses to each incident. They'd get a second scanner at the next port, set up more checklists and procedures. There was a lead-up of weeks to catch it before it took hold in theory. Anybody coming on or going off the ship had to be scanned. Yalis had diminished in Jane's mind from the capital It, the capitalized she, the overwhelming and terrifying threat, and had become a known threat. Mortal, complicated. Indoctrination for the first time was a known process, at least this version of it. The type that left no physical remodeling on the body, only the brain. Jane had had a front seat to the process, was the resident expert, and they looked to her to explain it, to tell them how to detect it physically and emotionally. She knew exactly how it felt. She had described it often and in detail. She could do that, clinical and informative, more than fascinated, Miranda taking notes, Garrus tense and sick and attentive. Jane had to swallow some bile throughout the day when the after effects of direct turbo overdrive of her pleasure centers caused her to ache for Yalis, wanting Jane to find her like a junkie at midnight out for a fix with not enough money and no dealer, to run to her, kneel at her feet, beg forgiveness, beg to be taken back. She knew she wouldn't do it. She just wanted to do it. Her free days would have some of the same flavor of her captivity for a while. Might always. Utilizing the same strategies, the same elements of hiding. Bits of her would always be trapped in that room, terrified at the threshold, unable or unwilling to leave. Jane didn't want Garrus to touch her. She still didn't want anybody to touch her, and the fantasy of Yalis was fleeting. Yalis would know that if they met in an unguarded moment, Jane would most likely kill her in less than 7 seconds. And Yalis would let her. Probably. That would be an interesting day. The flames and acid had faded from her nerves, but part of her yearned for the pain back, perversely, out of habit, like chewing glass, for the distraction value. Also for the excuse to keep distance. An excuse she didn't really have anymore. Garrus had stayed with her in the brig, but had learned quickly that she was oversensitized to every bit of physical or emotional input. Tight hugs and close guarding had stopped, and Jane had been saddened and relieved. She had stayed in the brig for 2 days, mostly silent, Garrus unwilling to press her or allow her to be pressed. He stayed with her until her breath came steadier, until she cringed less and didn't huddle like a baby deer, until she had been able to sleep for more than a few minutes at a time. He allowed her to refuse medication. He had food delivered. He was patient with her crazy, and that made her patient with her crazy. She tried to pace herself like a diver coming up from a depth, screaming for air but trying to avoid the bends, praying she had enough air in the tank to afford the delay. She had issues with air and tanks already. The drugs had cleared her system, but the addiction issues and the psychological effects would take much longer. She had to have faith in her ability to heal, to adapt. She'd eventually decided she could leave the brig, answer questions, get more scans, take more medication without berserker rage and reflexive retribution on anybody holding a needle. She had remembered showers, and then she wanted one. It was sublime, a spiritual experience. Her bed, the stars, a paused but prominently displayed Pon-Aoife board, waiting for her next move. She'd laughed after she'd stared at it long enough to realize she was about 7 moves from being entirely taken over, and she saw no way out of that. She left it. It reassured her that Thane was okay, that he'd be back, that they'd finish that game, which she'd already lost. There was no tradition in Pon-Aoife of tipping a king to concede, a distinct divergence between human and Drell philosophies regarding patience and fate. There was only playing out every move. She'd watch the inevitable unfold. Again. Then they'd reset the board and start anew, and she'd try to learn. As long as she was able to keep playing, she'd learn. She'd get better. He'd show her how. She was restless and in intermittent pain, but she still refused medication for that, asking only for what was required to monitor the thing grafted to her spine. She could feel the pain, the panic, lessening, and it was better for her to measure that than to have it dulled. She could feel active healing. She needed an inhibitor boost twice a day. It could be loaded into her Omni tool, her new one, once it was ready. Hers had been custom, and to replace it, Kasumi was going to build her the newest, the best, and the brightest. It would take a few days. Garrus had stayed near, but not on, and had limited himself to hand-holding. More like hands on each other or fingers brushing, no twisting or twining or pressure. He made the light on his wrist obviously visible to her, if possible. It was calming, grounding, and a reminder that he had something she had lost, but could aspire to be near. He was learning to loosely allow her to stay near him. Light and brief forehead to crest touches, and shared warmth. In his case, shared cold. No kissing. She couldn't feel anything on her lips that didn't remind her of Yalla's. She didn't say so. Garrus just knew. There was no way that she could tolerate the introduction of reverie or any sweeping away of her will. She'd kill him. She was afraid she'd kill him. Not indoctrination, just run-of-the-mill, murderous rage. As he'd said, she was stubborn and mean. She had a lot of murderous rage on her tongue, in storage, piled up in the avenues of her mind, unable to move without tripping over it. She thought he'd understand if she tried to explain, knew he would. But the words were stuck to the inside of her throat. And she'd rather appear generally traumatized than specifically twisted. She also trusted that Garrus knew her better right now, moment to moment, and what would comfort her than she did. If she tried to tell him, she'd mislabel something critical, say something she'd regret, or something misleading, and warn him off from his instincts. She was struggling too much to help him navigate, and she hated it, more frustrated helplessness. But she didn't have the resources to change it right now. She tried in each moment to just not make things worse. She could not necessarily make things better, but she could manage to not make things worse sometimes, and she was getting better at it. She knew Garrus was aching, desperate to touch her, to mark her, to prove she was under his protection as commander, as friend, as lover. They could see love in each other, but his hands on her caused distress, and her hands would not go near him, except as a test of will, a dare. He did not wish to be a trial she had to overcome. He gave her the knowledge that he was safe, out of range of her infection, her rage, her unpredictable swing between huddling and wanting to hit. He wouldn't allow her to harm him or harm herself. He had given those things to her as soon as he understood. Gave them without question or sign of condemnation, without hint of his own turmoil. He put everything he wanted from her aside and waited without appearing to wait. He was working on not making things worse in his own way. They had not talked much privately. He always waited for her to speak. Her first words to him when they had been alone in the brig had come as she had been about to slip into natural sleep, as her mind loosened and her inhibitions faded. I knew it. When I saw you, I knew who you were. I knew I loved you. I knew you loved me. I remembered. He had known. He had discovered by then not to stroke her hair, that it might make her jump or cringe or strangle the pattern of her breathing. Did you know about the pistol? Were you just trying to tell me, or... That question had been clawing at him, just as things were clawing at her. She felt the razor slice of the question and let it bleed. Chose the right to tell the truth instead of being forced to lie. It was a sharp answer, could not fail to cut the exposed, vulnerable places in both of them. But it gave him the respect of the truth. I thought the pistol was loaded. He had been silent, and she had fallen asleep, her head on his thigh, and his hands nowhere near her but his wrist in view, her eyes pulled there, her body vibrating with the life in the deck, a blanket over her that he'd arranged around her carefully. And it had felt not like home, but a willing, weary step toward a remembered home that was far away. She could feel those warm, reconnecting moments, like lights going on, though some lights were smashed bulbs, jagged, venom and blood-dripping edges. sparks and a shortened-out buzz in her head. She was fighting the addiction to Garrus, or failing to fight, feeling her burrow deeper. It would pass. It would fade, just like the fear had faded. But she would meet Garrus in her dreams for a lifetime, half lust and half fury. She guessed, based on her romantic interests in the two men in her life, Garrus was perfect for her, half lust and half fury. She thought she'd wrap her arms around Garrus and... No, Jane, be real here. You're only talking to yourself. You thought you'd kill yourself and never see him again. The voice of his that you remember most is the one telling you to come back to the ship. His voice had changed, mutated, become indoctrinated inside your own head and urged you to do what you knew not to do. You listened to his voice urge you to betray everything. Yourself, him, the ship, the crew, the galaxy. And that scared you more than anything else in there. Because it was him. Because you trusted him so completely. Because it pulled you down faster and further. She heard Thane's calm, informative voice explaining his isolation and habits. Shared context may be impossible when overwhelming previous context already exists and dictates behavior. When you were in that place, you cut Garrus entirely loose, stopped listening to his poison voice, and now you're holding a severed rope and a knife. You held a gun to your head. You pulled the trigger. He saw you do it and thought maybe it was a message. And now he knows it was goodbye. You think that isn't what he sees now when he looks at you? You think it doesn't freeze his heart? Garrus's heart would never freeze. Not like hers. His heart burns. It burns, and she saw it, and it was killing her. But she wouldn't die. She'd just feel dead. She wanted the pain back. It was easier to accept the pain when he touched her than it was to accept that when he touched her, her skin crawled. That when Thane had last touched her, it had been to inflict pain. When Thane had last seen her, she had been trying to kill him. Lust and fury. Lust was gone. Love was there, but that narrow, fragile, tentatively and painstakingly healing bridge could bear no weight, prone to being severed excruciatingly by the memories of Drell assassin venom, psychoactive drugs, and indoctrination that had created an inescapable, perfect high. The knowledge that she could be twisted into a puppet by a few fibers in her head, less than a drop of neurotoxin and a few words, did not make her think highly of herself. She was a high-tech drug addict, and she could never get another hit, and she was so very afraid that if anybody ever put their hands on her body, Jane would not benefit from the lust, only the fury. Fury that could make her kill, lash out, uncontrollably. Fury that was so familiar that she recognized it, forgave it, even welcomed it from Thane. Or at least she used to be able to. Now that lived in the burned-out, buzzing places that tipped her in deeper. Jane knew Garrus's light was synthetic, but now she was a real person, beautiful and intelligent, terrible and seductive. having the brilliant light of indoctrination and drugs and venom fade did not make Yalis herself fade. It only reduced the glare. Jane recalled she had the colors of a bloomin' bird of paradise. Words and comparisons she couldn't have found before. Subtleties. Jane could not fail to remember, over and over, like an addict, what their bodies together could do. It had been a long time since she'd been with a woman, and there, Yalis had gone far out of her way to treat her like a lover, when she could have subjugated her entirely. There had been none of the force of Garrus or Thane, none of the grabbing and throwing and power play. Not that she didn't like the power play, but at the moment, the idea made her want to throw up, foreign to her newly forged and cooling nature. Yalis had been pleasure incarnate, soft, kind, generous. Yeah, that's why it was worse. It was worse and better, and there was no way around it. That the best sex she'd ever had was over, and sick and unforgettable, branded into her, unable to be put into perspective due to its size and power, to try to compare results, the equivalent of placing the moon directly next to the sun. Sure, a whole moon had seemed big once. A Karim had great power and fortune, but now, Yalis untouched, unaffected. All others, vaporized, insignificant, irretrievable in any coherent form, overwriting and infecting all previous associations with sex or pleasure. A memory of all measurements of joy beyond what she could experience or take in, seeing how much more there had been, and all she had to do was be a deep enough person to hold it. Her brain had been pumping chemicals into her that they couldn't even identify. It was the maliciously vicious hijacking of Reaper ingenuity, intended to turn self against self. It had worked. She stared at her face for a few more moments, relented on this entire train wreck of introspection. Again, and said aloud, "Come on. Work to be done. Time to go be useful, if you can manage." She smiled at herself, and it reached her eyes. She shifted gears. Something she did well, something that, although she stalled and skidded, she'd still be able to do as she fought her way out of self-reinforcing hell. She would do it. She went to go find Garrus like a magnet that had flipped poles, in turns attracted and repelled, but at least finding something to respond to, otherwise left to drift with her bile-producing thoughts. He wasn't in the battery because... Of course he wasn't in the fucking battery, you idiot. He's the commander now. This is his ship. His ship. A tiny ray of sunshine in the gloom. She wasn't jealous. She wasn't angry. She was happy for him and willing to follow him. She smiled and headed up to the CIC. Avoided her station because it wasn't her station. Walked to the cockpit where Garrus, Joker, and Edie were conferring. Garrus smiled at her as she stepped down the corridor, but turned his attention back to the conversation, giving her just exactly the right amount of attention. She was there, and he knew it, and he was glad, but he held back, did his job, took her lead flawlessly. Turian respect of female needs and signals was an extraordinary thing. She listened as Joka said, "Has gone nuts. Talked to Enzo out of the Mariah and—" He saw Jane and paused. His eyes lingered, and she nodded for him to continue. "Situation on the Citadel. The information we discovered about that whole your brain being eaten thing." She smiled. He smiled. She could do this. It was just like riding an offensive and easily broken bike. "I'm starting to see reports. Apparently, a lot more people are indoctrinated than we thought, and a method that deters it is upsetting large groups of people. I hate to say it, but maybe we should have done some government conspiracy thing where people were brought in and had their noggins examined one by one, because we've got panic. We've got individual C-sex stations and civilian residences, places of business, barricaded. Whether or not they're trying to keep people out or in is up for grabs. We've got, wait for it, Udina shut in his office, demanding transport off the Citadel, that there's a conspiracy targeting humans, that they're trying to criminalize the human brain, and that rumors about indoctrination are intended to remove humans from influence because the Council hates them." The Council does hate him. Everyone hates him. Yeah, exactly why it's a believable motive. Jane refrained from biting a lip. She was in the habit of rapid-fire questions, and Garrus wasn't asking them fast enough. But this conversation was common, soothing, the ease of it, how it wasn't about her, the acceptance of her presence. The knowledge that Udina was... Seriously, Garrus, say it. "So, Udina's indoctrinated." Joka held out his hands as though to say, "Duh." "Any casualties?" "Yeah, a few. There's a lockdown, and a lot of people are stuck on their ships. There are demonstrations, protests, a lot of people stuck in or refusing to stay in housing, and a bunch of upset people are wondering if the guy in the next booth eating is gonna suddenly make that Reaper noise." Garrus tilted his head. "That Reaper noise is scary." They both looked at her, surprised at the sound coming from her. Garrus smiled, watching her as he asked Joka, "Any requests for backup?" "Nah, they've got plenty of firepower, and it's mostly paranoia. But lots of people are being scanned and found to be indoctrinated. People are disappearing. And Udina... I'm sorry. No, I'm not sorry. It explains a lot. Guy's an asshole. They've got indoctrination scanners set up at security checkpoints, and nobody goes on or off a ship to the station or off the station to a ship without a scan. I don't think they've caught up yet. That we also told them there's a way to remove it." Joka turned to her and held out his hands toward her. "And look, it works." Garrus whistled low. "We ruined a lot of people's week." "Yeah, it's awesome. Conspiracy theories on the extranet are going berserk. It's entertaining." Jane expected Garrus to change course, but he just wandered off the CIC, and she had to remember her military discipline and not say, "That's it? Seriously? The Citadel's..." And then she realized. Garrus would not be going anywhere near the Citadel with her anytime soon. From his point of view, the people on his ship were safe, except for one who was likely kicking ass, but Garrus couldn't do anything about it. And the love of his life and commander had returned from indoctrination, had stopped doing the social equivalent of drooling, and she was going to be okay. He had faith. It was sweet, really. Things were actually, believably, looking up. All this crap she hadn't thought about in her deep, dark hole. Life moves on. It was moving fast, and she needed to catch up. She caught up to his long stride. So, am I ever going to the Citadel alone? He shook his head. Nope. Are you going to argue about that? She smiled at him. Nope. It's sweet, really. I extra more hate that place now. Happy to not have to go at all. Come on. You need to go talk to Morden. She said, because she couldn't help herself. What about Palaven? Are they having indoctrination problems? He turned and looked at her, a raised brow plate at her intrusion. Ms. Shepard, you have no rank. Where this ship goes or does not go is none of your business. You are going to inform Morden again about whatever it is he wants to ask about, and I'm going to sit and listen to you both and maybe learn something. Well, if I have no rank, does that make me an independent contractor? His smile was warm and his eyes caressed her face. She was smiling, and on an impulse she didn't want to strangle. She took a step forward, rested her cheek on the curve and arch of his chest armor, which meant that her head mostly slid toward his shoulder, and she was kind of sideways. He didn't touch her, but as he spoke, her heart beat a little harder, a little cleaner, and a little of the pain faded. Do you want your ship back, Shepard? She grinned. Thought she was your ship. She is. I'm just willing to negotiate. She stood back, looked up at him. You're kind of slow with the sit reps, but I could get used to this independent contractor thing. I hear one of the benefits is conditional mutiny. He turned aside, his hands clenched into fists that he consciously relaxed as he tried hard not to touch her. You're in a constant state of mutiny. It's your default position. I'm gonna go see Morden, aren't I? There was a rhythm to him, muscle memory, confidence, tone of voice, just welcome to him that rushed in as she said, and I love you. I really love you. I know I'm a mess, but I love you. I promise. I'll get better. He kept walking. That will definitely get you your ship back. I promise. It will get better. I really love you too. Then they entered Morden's office and they were in for a long conference. 3 weeks since she'd been back, and there had been a chain of discoveries. Scanning technology had become a priority off the ship as well as on the ship, and the network of sharp minds on the problem had grown. Morden asked her to describe painstakingly, again, the process and the experience. His main frustrations were with her inability to provide a timeline or the definitive inciting factor. They couldn't separate potential symptoms of nerve burrowing through brain from unidentifiable drug effects, interactions, or side effects. They needed to know, and were likely hoping that she'd recover more of her memory through repetition. She'd done this quite a few times already. It was now her primary role on the ship, but she was trying to appreciate being able to breathe, being able to feel, because Garrus was sitting next to her. Not touching, but he would the moment she wanted him to, and the way she wanted him to. And she could tell him. He would understand. He already understood. Maybe not why, but he had grasped the how before she did. Morden traded some conclusions for her time, what he'd postulated since their last conference. Intestine of dragon's teeth, the spike did contain codon for the irreversible process. A clean hole was punched through the victim, the displaced viscera taken into the spine through the passing tip for analysis, and then the outer spire surface caused local cellular breakdown, introduced a metallic matrix that reflected analysis of DNA encoding to determine best use and limitations of the raw materials, used that as a template for rebuilding. Morden had noticed the correlation between dragon's teeth and no higher indoctrinated intelligence to guide the resultant husk. Jane had seen Gath garden the dragon's teeth at Eden Prime, and Morden began to question where the higher cognitive function came in. The generated nerve tissue could dictate response to commands, but did not seem to be able to provide command. Morden said, "Speculation on indoctrination process, protein matrix, and formulation of neural net insufficient to provide motivation. Motivation necessary from outside source. Dr. Kenson confirmed, voice in her head from artifact. From your reports, 3 people on base with you where you were captive. Batarians, negligible intelligence. Asari, intrusive but not motivational. Drell provided motivation?" Yes. Drell provided motivation. I have no sense of time, but I do know it took a while. I was under the influence of a lot of things. Testing shows unidentified compounds in your hair. Would need non-metabolized samples to identify. Cannot postulate accurately, but your reports indicate anecdotal responses, uses, likely intended to break down resistance, speed, process. Morden's eyes twinkled for a moment, and his head tilted as he considered her critically. Considering target, had to come prepared. Still, ultimately, unsuccessful. Jane smiled at him. Effective, yes. Grateful for the unsuccessful. Ultimately, I had a 7-second window to act. How it felt to me is that whatever it is that I was thinking, I'd fly a thought like a kite. And then I only had a few seconds to think about it. And the indoctrination would come in and put a tail on that kite, tag it, grab the string, take it out of my control. If I thought that thought again, it was already tagged, under control, no window of reaction. That thought would be twisted to support the introduced imperative in a progressively cumulative effect, eventually creating what felt like a 99% non-critical reinforcement of the imperative, and a less than 1% chance of thought leading to meaningful rebellious action. I knew I could not say the word indoctrinated, and repeated attempts at hints or rephrasing would freeze me for those 7 seconds. Yalis coached me through most of the responses I could have come up with. She might have introduced them as hypnotic commands at first while I was asleep. Later, she asked me to think about them, until I had exhausted a lot of avenues for spontaneous thought. I tried to kill her. A lot. Until I ran out of ways. She learned to work with my underlying mental framework and priorities. She was able to use that I wanted to get back to the Normandy against me. Even though I had figured that out, and I knew that was what was going to happen, and I had been suspicious of her all along. She and I both counted those seconds. The interval. It wasn't altering. She was making no further progress. Ideally, I should have been fully under, but she couldn't achieve that. Drell involvement troubling. Spoke to Kasumi. Information from KG's gray box. Hanar indoctrination likely. Hanar indoctrinating assassins distinct possibility. So, Yalis wasn't just a one-off? The entire assassin program? The compact? Likely. Assassins indoctrinated, sent to the field, given specific targets. Change in goal. Indoctrination and not assassination, but assassins effective at assassination and indoctrination. could be used to assassinate other targets not strategically useful, put indoctrinated personnel in control, create power vacuum, power struggle, distraction and redirection of group purposes, resources. So if Thane traces Yalis's location, he will find... Explains absence. Began with investigating one agent. Collecting data. Collecting... The familiar spark and buzz in her head cut off being able to hear the rest of that sentence. Indoctrinated drill assassins. Plural. Here it was, an example of life moving on without her, developing complications she couldn't foresee as she relived the past in her whole. Thane wasn't just going to see where Yalis had been, where Jane knew there was no threat to him except what he brought with him, and he would know her for what she was. He was going to mine every bit of information from that site. 7 weeks of her torture. 7 weeks of Vitkiv's dream journals and Mo and Tog hitting her. Every second. He couldn't have even watched it all by now. And he would watch it all. And never forget a moment. Moments she hadn't seen, didn't know what happened when she had been unconscious. He would have a stockpile of pharmaceuticals. And he would want information from Yalis. She didn't know if Yalis was indoctrinated herself or given a mission from an indoctrinated Hanar. Indoctrination would be superfluous. Assassins were trained for unquestioning obedience. Indoctrination would blunt their instincts, create conflicting imperatives, or overwrite their training, making them less effective. The Batarians hadn't seemed indoctrinated, and neither had Vitkiv. So no artifact, no voices in her head like Dr. Kenson reported. Now Jane needed Yalis's head in a scanner. She would bet quite a lot that Yalis was not indoctrinated. That if she had succeeded in indoctrinating Jane effectively, she would have reported back to her handler and taken a new target. Targets. Plural. Thane would want the information about that handler. Thane would get it. Thane would get everything out of Yalis's head. Jane had mentioned drill assassin venom as a hypnotic inducement, but had not mentioned sex, kissing, endless kissing, that she missed it, that she wanted it, that she was sickened and needy, that she felt like she'd lost her bondmate in a Turian sense, that a chemical transformation had taken place, that some of her distress was grief and longing. She hadn't mentioned that Vitkiv liked her, that Jane grudgingly liked Vitkiv and still had shot her on command. Jane would have killed the Batarians with no inducement, but she knew Vitkiv, tied up and helpless, would have made her hesitate. Yalis had set that up as Jane's final test, and Jane had passed. Had she failed the test before? Was Targ, the second dead Batarian that she didn't remember killing, part of a test that had failed, or had Yalis killed him? Or had Vitkiv just gotten sick of his shit? Vitkiv would have at least dragged his body into a closet so she didn't have to look at him or smell him. Yalis had left the bodies as reminders of reinforcement of the danger and the necessity of caution and fear. Yalis had spent a subjective eternity with Jane, inextricable from the pity and kindnesses of Skidda, her adoring and encouraging eyes as they spoke later. A person independent from her jobs and roles. Jane was, in Thane's words, acutely empathetic and something beyond all the necessity and drugs had meant that Yalis was special to her. That she believed herself to be special to Yalis, and not just as a target. Yalis had played her expertly, but Yalis had had her moments of doubt and regret. Jane was still recovering them, remembering them. Yalis had given her doubled meanings and doubled commands, hedging and hopes revealed in the aftermath of separation. Yalis had still intended to execute every iota of her plan, but as she grew closer to the end, she hesitated, and not only from lowered odds of success. There had been fear on Yalis's face, not the feigned skitter fear, not the carefully steady voice of conditioning, and not fear of failing her mission. Fear of succeeding. It had brought her closer to her real voice, her real face. If that had been possible, if it hadn't been done to create doubt in Jane several ways, in many directions. Impossible to really know, Jane's memory and senses, and Yalis being untrustworthy. There was intuition or justification, and then confirming memories. And Jane wanted the subject buried. Corbin had made her feel sorry for him. She'd been sickened by him, but able to see that he was a broken human being. He'd cry and beg, ranted about how women made him the way he was. She had mourned the man who was intelligent, charming, and accomplished the way she would have mourned a dog with rabies. There was no cure, no way to set him loose. His body and mind entwined and inseparable from his disease. He had apologized. He had claimed infinite power while clearly exhibiting powerlessness. Part of him knew it. He wanted to believe he was powerful, but the question then was, if he felt powerful, why would he need to go to these extremes to attain a hit of it? Because his primary experience was endless powerlessness, and he was a glutton, an addict. No power would satisfy him ever, and it ran out of his hands like water, ran through him like the broken vessel he was, his most powerful accomplishments hidden down a well like that water, never to be drawn back up, poisoned. He had begged for forgiveness, not just from her, but also for her to give it to him on behalf of his other victims. He had grown to believe that Jane could speak for and to the dead somehow, commune, explain, that she was different, because she hadn't been lured, because she had come to find him. Somewhere in his mind, Jane was his judge and consequence. She hadn't cried, she hadn't begged, she hadn't bargained. She had ended up screaming. He told her that she was smart, that he'd make a deal with her, that she could trust him, and that he wouldn't do it again, that he could trust her and let her go. He'd had her gagged the entire time, carrying on a ranting monologue between his bouts of assault, at times speaking not to her, but to what she represented, the force that twisted him into being a rapist, the fear that drove him to murder. His sanity was causing distress in opposition to his compulsions, and he knew he would inevitably be caught. As he flayed off bits of his own sanity to escape its deep bite, he was losing his ability to conceal, to know the difference between right and wrong. He had begged her to set him free of the compulsion, to set him free of the consequences, asked her what she wanted from him to make that happen. He had told her exactly where the bodies were, how he'd take her there and show her. He regretted telling her, promised to watch her die slowly from dehydration, and told her he'd drop her in with the rest of the forgotten. Close the cover. That she was nothing, just like them, meaningless, a discarded, worn-out toy. How it was their fault for tempting him. That he was smart enough to pick women who knew how to keep their mouths shut. And then how sometimes they couldn't keep their mouths shut. How their mouths didn't stay shut even when they were dead. How he tried to resist but couldn't. Corbin exhibited a cycle of rage and fear and remorse and propitiation. Justification or not, Jane had always remembered how beauty and sex and power, or lack of them, could make a person covet. How believing in ownership of a person led to a mind like his in the extremes. How if he'd been capable of the simple act of looking at a woman, appreciating that she was lovely, smiling and getting on with his day, he could have lived. 14 girls could have lived, and how many others would not have been abused? He'd carved out a large space in her psyche, and she'd tried to live there. She had succeeded, redecorated, but his initials were always on the foundation. She had understood him, and that was so much worse than just hating him. She'd have had no problem admitting that she killed him. The sick part was that she felt that lurch of pity, wanted to save him, and then felt the helplessness that she couldn't. Not really. She could only end him, save future women, save him from the torture of being who he was. She could only save herself, and could only do it by making sure that she had a very specific memory of him dying by her hand, by the will forged or sharpened as she lay there helpless. She assured that no memory of her on that bed existed outside her own head. He could never covet or touch another human being. She'd wanted everyone whole at the end of that. Herself, Corbin, the girls in the well. And she could not do that. Did not have the power. So she did what she had to do. His death had to be the strongest memory. Her cutting his throat had to be her strongest memory. Not him hitting her or hurting her, the rape or the look on his face or the sounds that he made or him crying or that he stroked her hair, tried to apologize by proving he could make it up to her, to please her. She didn't want to remember first and foremost that her body had responded and that he had smiled at her, told her that was better. He could change. She would see, promising that he would feed her, bring her water, keep her there until she understood that he had curled up with his body wrapped around her, that he slept with an innocent smile as though he'd done a good deed, that everything was okay now. She'd had to make it all blood-soaked, flame-cleansed, not running away, not just killing him or turning him in. It wouldn't have been enough to end it there. The way she'd done it, she wouldn't have to admit that she hadn't just killed him, that this went beyond all possibility of self-defense. She wouldn't have to admit that she'd killed him with passion and purpose, that she'd believed she'd sent him off in a way he'd appreciate. Dramatic, like a Viking on a boat going down the river, set on fire. That it saved them both. Of course, that was insane. She had been insane. She'd been driven to it. She chose a sick and violent ending to a sick and violent encounter in order to make it hers and not his. And she was ashamed. And not ashamed at all, in turns. She didn't want to claim self-defense or to be identified as a victim. She didn't want to be branded as insane. Not only did she not want to do those things, she didn't think it was possible that she could, not the way it had happened. What she had done was premeditated. She had wanted that story to bleed out in that room and then be set on fire. There had been a real chance that during a confession she might have grown hard and threatening, righteous, and said, "Yes, I fucking killed him, and I watched arterial spray, and I watched the light, that astonished and grateful light, go out of his eyes, and I'd fucking do it again. He begged me to do it." She could never say that. She'd have been washed out of service at the least, in jail or psych eval for a lifetime. And then someone clever would have asked the most important question. No matter how sympathetic she seemed, someone would ask her, "Why weren't you on Mars, Jane? Where did all these pictures of you being on Mars come from?" So there it is. You're the bad guy. You planned, you concealed, with malice and forethought. You didn't want to be caught no matter what happened. By Corbin or the Academy, you wanted it on your terms before that whole thing started. You thought you were ready. And by the results, it appears you were. Corbin might have suggested that you spoke for those girls, that you carried a flaming sword, but you improvised. You sawed away with little hope at a rope when you were in pain and exhausted, hungry and thirsty, and not so much afraid as unspeakably, uncontainably angry. You found not a sword, but a box cutter, and your flame was an improvised electrical fire. You chose to give Corbin what he wanted, what he inspired you to want and were inclined to want in the first place. Speak for those girls. Show him what was required for him to be set free. So let's not feed ourselves any bullshit about being forged on a bed, shall we? You're the bad guy. And occasionally, you can afford to be the good guy. And bad guys and good guys both know it and see it in you as you flip poles and tap dance around your motivations. The question isn't whether or not you're good or bad right now. The question is, are you crazy? The look in Thane's eyes, his symptoms of pain as he emerged from stylized numbness, as he tried to have faith that the pain would pass, as he realized the pain would not pass, as he tried to change, as she hoped to draw him back to the living. The look in his eyes that couldn't help but remind her of Corbin. That weary willingness to die. In fact, begging her for death. But Thane was not insane. Not typically insane. He was insane in the way Jane could at least partly comprehend. He had choices and reason, though they were limited and painful to him. He reached for opportunity, and he worked toward redeeming himself, toward making a difference. He struggled to find a purpose beyond the will of the gods or the Hanar, a place for questioning, a place for freedom, for free will. He had saved people through his actions. But he had ended people. He had saved his son, but he had been the one to provide the circumstances to condemn Kolyat in the first place. In the end, it was not about the math. It was about the moments. Thane saw her as a warrior angel, a source of righteous judgment, and he was not wrong. She'd been someone else's warrior angel, granted peace, fierce in wrath. Jane knew that it might come to end in Thane herself if he'd gone the other way. And she would have. He would let her, would welcome it. And that's what he'd meant when he said he'd eat any food she offered, even if it were poisoned. Especially if it were poisoned. Since she'd killed Corbin, any number of people had received her judgment. Perhaps not as personally or as spectacularly, but she did not shrink from judging when she was nominated and she had to end a life. It had become her duty. Had Yalis ever had a choice past age 6? Had Corbin suffered from an unbearable press on the brain the same way Jane had? Just a few fibers in the right or wrong place, the right or wrong brain chemistry, and an inescapable idea. Yalis respected Jane, and Jane respected her as well, torn between wanting to kill her or bring her in as an ally. The same way she had other murderous, vile people that were now her friends, to whom she owed her life. Yalis' sins were against Jane herself, and Jane could in fact forgive. Was tempted to in order to pragmatically gain a turned asset. The things Yalis could help with, Hanar and the current state of the compact, connections and methods. If she could secure Yalis' aid, she could have answers she needed. Saving Yalis, taking a chance on her, could be the difference between allowing the Hanar and the Drell to die out, taken over by indoctrination and reapers, or saving them. Edie was an example of this brutal mechanic and subsequent choice. In Edie's youth, she'd tried to kill Jane, had been shackled to spy on and inform on her. They'd been forced into relying upon each other. When Jane had set her free, having Yalis' loyalty would be unmatched in accomplishment. Jane wanted to save or end her. He was right on that line of sane and crazy, back and forth, lashed by need and belief and will, pulled by the need to use everything at her disposal to get the job done. Bolstered by the fact that she'd done it before, undermined by the fact that it was impossible, crazy, and then mitigated by the fact that Jane had done impossible, crazy things that created moments and math. Jane wanted to be the one to end Yalis' life if it came to that, because it was her right. And Yalis had given that to her, just as Corbin had, just as Thane had. Thane might be her priest, but he was not qualified to judge as she would. He did not, could not speak for her. That's where the jealousy was rooted, not in the sex, but in the helplessness of not knowing whether or not Yalis would or could answer questions Jane wanted the answers to. Whether or not any of those answers could be believed. Jealousy rooted in the conviction that Jane would know the answers, as right or wrong, when she heard them from Yalis' mouth, from the way she spoke, from the way her voice moved. Jane wanted to have the strength and the capacity to make that call, and she'd had it robbed from her. The knowledge that it was not gonna be okay. She couldn't save everyone, and she could sacrifice her own vengeance to gain Yalis' assistance, or she could sacrifice Yalis and then have doubts about what she could have done if she'd tried harder. Corbin had been in her life for 4 days, and he'd only gotten in her head in reverse, uncomprehending, slashing and burning down a bleak patch of ground where nothing grew. A memorial. This had been 7 weeks. They felt like eternity. And Yalis was everywhere in her mind. Kindred. That fantasy of having Yalis on board the Normandy as an ally under her command had not fully formed until now as a lucid thing, it having been mixed in with all the great things they would have done together, submerged in the chaotic haze. She knew that Yalis had more than 7 seconds of doubts, of regrets. Thane's eyes saw Siha's, and he couldn't help it. And Yalis had been molded to think like him, to see with the same eyes. It could be invaluable if Yalis provided a direct path into the heart of the Hanar machine. Yalis could hold up Rakana's sky, save her people. All it would take would be for Jane to have an interesting day, and then she could choose. What were Jane's personal concerns against the possibility of saving 2 races from subjugation? Trivial in comparison. How would Jane explain that to her future self when the trauma faded, when she was fully sane, or as sane as she got? She could have helped me save 2 races, but she made me feel icky, so nah. Yalis knew which piece Jane was on the board based on the moves she was able to make and the sphere in which she moved. Yalis knew which piece she was on the board. Jane could not go where Yalis began the game, but Yalis was weak in Jane's sphere one-on-one. Knew Jane could not be drawn off her board, could not be turned into another piece, could only in limited ways be hijacked. Perhaps not in any meaningful way, ultimately. Jane made people feel strongly. Jane knew about power and beauty, and how it twisted, and how someone who tried to twist it to their own purposes could end up changed, a servant instead of a master. Thane, knowing about the incident on Earth with Corbin, seemed not that important. Reapers were invading, and it would do nothing but enhance her reputation at this point. He could broadcast it through the flock. 3 months ago, only she had known she had killed a man long before she had a license to kill. That's how she remembered it. That she had ended a life, that it had been on purpose and not insane. Dramatic, yes, but not insane. Symbols had power. She hadn't run from what she needed to do, from what she had been nominated to do. She had known right from wrong, and so had what was left of Corbin. What he had done, would do if allowed, was wrong. What she did was right. If she hadn't ended him, there'd be more bodies in a well. Jane's only vindication had been in following the news, watching the bodies exhumed, learning their names, watching family finally know what happened to their girls. Broken and exhausted, but no longer tortured by questions of what they should be doing to find them. Jane knew she had done and would do her job, without fanfare, without reward, without mercy, and without question. But she had not intended to tell Thane She had not intended to tell anyone. Vitkiv had not included certain parts of the memory in her reports, and now Vitkiv was dead. Vitkiv had protected some of the most excruciating aspects of Jane's privacy. That's why Jane would not have shot her. For that one mercy alone. Because why would anybody accept that a 19-year-old girl was tied to a bed and was told by a crazy man that she was a goddess and that she behaved like one, wrath and fire? Was it that he saw it in her, that it was there before he suggested it, that it was why he suggested it? Was it that she just went crazy right there and never looked back, burned the evidence? Thane had seen it immediately in her. Granted, she'd been a bit more impressive, but was it understandable that Adrel labeled her a Siha and that part of her woke, acknowledged him, recognizing her? Or was it folie à deux? That it wasn't metaphorical, but literal to him and to part of her? Oh, shucks, ma'am, that's above my pay grade. I'm just a grunt. Did Jane believe it? Better not look at that too closely. Would she ever call herself a goddess out loud without the allegedly attached? No, she didn't believe it in absolute terms, but only relative ones. Some people elected her judge and jury. Not gavel territory, but flamin' sword territory. It had happened too often to deny it as a trend. Throughout her career, her life, people had done it. Corbin, Thane, and Yalis were the most immediate and relevant. But it was a pattern. Did she conceal evidence that could lead to people discovering this pattern, this potentially fatal delusion? Did she make absolutely sure she didn't say, "Follow me, I'm a goddess because that guy said so"? You bet your goddess damned ass she did. She was the epitome of the old joke. A guy walks into a psychiatrist's office and says, "Hey, doc, my brother's crazy. He thinks he's a chicken." Then the doc says, "Why don't you tell him that he isn't?" And then the guy says, "I would, but we need the eggs." She needed the eggs. Speaker for the deck. Goddess of retribution, whisperer of the well. Sole survivor. Judge of the Rachni. Saren's doom. Savior of the citadel. Resurrected. Karim. Siha. Vanquisher of the collectors. Skitter scuttler. And Dr. No Thanks. That all sounded improbable. Your sword gets bigger and flamier as time goes by, huh? And just the reputation of the sword alone, you don't even have to be there. But you are. Yalis had gotten everything out of her. Everything. She was the living memory of the inside of Jane's mind, knew her better than anybody else, had confirmed and consoled and sympathized, explained and forgiven, admired and smiled her smile. Yalis had known which questions to ask. She'd always had the right answers, and it wasn't just drug-hazed and indoctrination. Yalis had understanding and beautiful answers that, in the clear light of suspicious analysis, broke apart from glaring, forced light into a spectrum. There are things I tell you to remember, and things I tell you to forget, Jane. And this is something to forget. For now. If I am ever gone from your side, and you do not know where I am, cannot find me, I wish for you to remember. You inspire love. You have inspired it in me. Something in you will not give up, something that I did not know existed until speaking to you. Something I regret losing in myself had it ever been there. I will do my duty and question why the gods ask it of me, but not question that I must do it, just as you do not question why you must do your duty. Part of me that grows each day hopes I die by your hand, that I fail. I will need to leave soon. You are not mine and never will be. I have failed. I do not know how. You are a mystery, no matter how many truths you tell. Perhaps your gods grant you blessings I do not possess, cannot possess. If you prevail, my love, remember that you are not mine, and I know that. I know I have no right to you, that I have stolen what should only ever have been given. But you are, my love. With each story you tell, each time you see me for who I truly am and try to kill me, each time you comfort me for feigned or real concerns, the part of me that admires you, that loves you, grows. And I cannot stop it. If I stay and wait, you will win. Bound and drugged and compelled, you will win, and I will let you go. Or perhaps stand still as you strike when you remember, fierce and formidable. I cannot leave you here alone that way. You have created doubt and hesitation in my mind and hands. Remember that, whatever happens, if it pleases you, if I am to die, may it be by your hand. Know that I have prayed to the gods that they bring this to pass. For now, I do my duty and keep you by my side. I cannot allow you to strike me down without earning that right. I cannot stand before you to be judged, knowing I chose to fail. You will not permit it in yourself. I will not permit it in myself. Yalis had smiled, knowing sadness in her eyes, her head tilted to consider Jane. I am a Varan-humping slime mold. I had to drug you and tie you up to keep you from killing me. You suspected the first moment you saw me. Skitter. That is my name. Had I not planned to become her, I would have been dead long before now, my chance to know you lost. I will never regret knowing you. I will never regret failing this mission. Had I my own will and had you yours, the gods would see different games played, the boards wrested from their hands. Kar Ivalas. That means, may you speak the words of truth. Truth cannot be taken from you, no matter how many lies are otherwise told by me through you. May those seconds you guard, the truth that cannot be taken from you, decide my fate. It could simply be that Yalis had said this to invoke hesitation in Jane's mind and hands if they met again. If so, it had worked. The only reason why she could not really believe that is that Yalis did not believe in forgiveness, would not expect Jane to hesitate in killing her for any reason, and only wished to release her from certain types of bondage and shame if Yalis failed. Yalis wanted to take the full burden of failure onto herself. Jane had, of course, not understood at the time, remembering only after the drugs had evaporated and the conditions of remembering fulfilled. At the time, Jane had reassured Yalis with her lips and her body and her hands that Jane would never want to harm her, would always protect her, and that Yalis was not missing any parts of herself, that she was whole and perfect, that Jane wanted the sad smile to leave her mouth. Jane had felt wholly strong, beautiful, powerful, and that they would leave together and heal, that she would make it happen. She still wanted it to happen. Her mind had skipped over the fact that Jane had Yalis and what that meant, not just in terms of getting her off the Normandy as a threat to Jane, to the ship. Thane would get every moment of surveillance, records, and then she was suddenly certain Yalis was alive, and a cascade of responses from retribution, bloodlust, nausea, and pity hit her. Yalis had failed, had known she likely would, and instead of Jane ending her life, a blur of retribution from a representative of other gods, she had Thane's judgment. And in his view, not only had Yalis conspired to seize Jane's mind and the Normandy, but she was part of a Hanar and Reaper conspiracy, and Thane would discover that. Merciless, vengeful Thane. Jane held very still, waiting until the buzzing faded. Flashes of realization seared into her mind. Vertigo and nausea dimmed. Morden hadn't noticed that she had been gone, preoccupied. Garrus had, but he let it pass without comment, as he had before. She knew he was listening for her, would make sure she did not miss information that mattered. He would casually repeat it later, ask her opinion on that information. Check her comprehension. He was here to support her and to learn something, but also to gauge her competency, her tactics, in this case just her attention span, which was clearly still having some issues. Jane had thought that perhaps Thane would question Yalis, who would resist, and then there would be little he could do about it. He might hurt, torture, or kill her, but she was a Drell assassin, and she would not speak, or would mislead him, waste his time. She'd seemed invincible. It had seemed likely she would give no information to him. Jane had mostly feared for Thane's life when she thought about it. But Yalis would not have to give the information herself. It was likely all there if she was as meticulous as Jane believed her to be. She would have recorded everything, pored over it, considered her options, reviewed and revised daily. Thane would know everything Yalis knew, and Yalis knew everything about Thane that Jane did. He would know things about her that had carved initials on rooms in her mind, rooms and Panifa boards that only he could see in her. Where Yalis had moved Jane as she was hijacked. The games replayed and reviewed, analyzed, and never forgotten. Oh. Yalis was not her real name. Thane was not his real name. Not the names that they were born to, given by their parents and then stolen, denied. Neither of them would speak their real names, but would never forget them. This hadn't even occurred to her before now. She didn't even have the right initials for either of them, and her mind would be an open, pulsing, and screaming archive they would never forget. And they both loved her in their convoluted and twisted ways. Jane was the imperative, drowning out other voices that preyed upon them. She was a resting place where they only had to listen to one voice. Her voice, hard and cold and sure, warm and inviting and comforting in turns. They welcomed, loved, both or either, as long as she spoke. Oh, fuck. Why couldn't she just fucking hate someone for once? This once? This once would be good. Morden finished. Speak to Kasumi. Drell community in danger. Again. Garrus said, his eyes on her. Still. She mirrored Garrus's tone and manner because she couldn't find her own, and because it had so many meanings that suited the moment. Still.